Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Gian Melloni. I work for SMV in Nepal, South Asia. But the reason why I'm speaking to you now is that I led the DRC WASH Consortium from 2016 to its completion in 2019. That was for Concern Worldwide in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm glad to be part of this event with Agenda for Change and to be in the company of such great speakers and participants. This presentation will look at the DRC WASH Consortium from the angle of system strengthening in a generally very fragile context, with an emphasis on financial sustainability. I hope it will be interesting to listen to. This is a snapshot of the water, sanitation, and hygiene service levels in DRC, taken from the SDG 6 baseline. We don't need to look into the details. This is just to show you the challenging WASH situation, particularly in the rural parts of DRC. This is due to a broad range of reasons which do not necessarily relate directly to WASH. One of the key problems is that underlying chronic issues are compounded by rapid onset crisis, in a cycle that sometimes tends to repeat itself. For instance, during the life of the DRC WASH Consortium 2013-2019, DRC had 3 separate Ebola outbreaks, not to mention measles, yellow fever, and more seasonal events such as cholera and malaria. Plus, social and political instability that often degenerate into violence and trigger waves of internal displacement in several parts of the country. This is the context where the DRC WASH Consortium operated. The consortium was a project by Concern Worldwide, implemented with ACF, ACTED, CRS, and Solidarité Internationale. The consortium was funded by DFID for about £30 million over 6 years. The consortium started in 2013 and completed its cycle in 2019. The project supported about 600 rural communities to achieve sustainable water, sanitation, and hygiene, about 650,000 people in 7 different provinces. If you look at the map on the screen, you will see that areas are color-coded. Green for concern, red for ACF, blue for ACTED, brown for CRS, and yellow for Solidarité. These intervention areas were selected because of the needs, but also because they had to show potential to be accessible for development work for extended periods of time. This is the reason why the consortium didn't operate in war-torn areas such as the North Kivu. Now let's take a look at the strategic framework of the DRC WASH Consortium. The overarching goal of the project was to reinforce sustainability of WASH services. That was done in different ways. In water supply in particular, we followed the economic approach, which I'm going to describe later on. While for sanitation and for hygiene practices, we used community empowerment methodologies inspired by CLTS. There was also a lot of work done on the enabling environment. That meant to work at the local level, not only with the communities, but also with the local authorities, with healthcare authorities, with province authorities. And it also meant to try and reinforce local supply chain of hand pump equipment and materials. We did also quite some work at the national level, which meant coordination with national authorities at the ministry level, but also working actively to strengthen sector coordination and sector learning. Now let's take a look at the economic approach, which was the adaptation by the DRC WASH Consortium of the life cycle cost approach to the context of rural DRC. The overall idea was that communities would raise finances to meet the life cycle costs of their water points. Communities that chose plans to raise funds to cover basic O&M costs would reach level 1. Communities who were able to raise finances also for larger repairs would be at level 2. And communities who could potentially cover the water point replacement costs at the end of its life cycle would meet level 3. As I mentioned before, the economic approach was inspired by the life cycle cost approach. The equivalence table that you see on the screen shows the differences between those two different approaches. Broadly speaking, levels 1, 2, and 3 of the economic approach corresponded to operating and minor maintenance expenditure and to capital maintenance expenditure in the life cycle cost terminology. However, expenditure on direct support and capital expenditure was not part of the 3 levels. That was because it would have been not realistic to expect rural communities in DRC to show the ability to meet such thresholds. And now let's take a look at the results of the economic approach. What you see on this slide is a sample of the total number of committees in the DRC WASH Consortium that were in charge of managing the water points that were installed. However, this kind of data reflects the final overall results of the project. What we see here is that about 70% of the committees achieved at least level 1. Within this 70%, we can see that 47%, which means about half of the total number of committees, achieved level 1, while smaller percentages achieved levels 2 or 3. We see also that about 30% of the committees remained below level 1. This means that the committees that manage the water points were still in place, and communities would still financially contribute towards operation and maintenance costs. However, they did not manage to reach the threshold of level 1. Also, something important to describe here is that analyzing our data allowed us to identify success factors linked to the economic approach. First of all, revenue generating activities. Revenue generating activities are activities where a WASH committee would reinvest water fee cash into productive activities such as small-scale agriculture or livestock, and would resell the produce when the need came to carry out maintenance of the water points. And what we saw based on our data is that committees that put in place revenue generating activities performed much better than committees that did not, under the 3 levels of the economic approach. We also saw that self-remuneration of committees was a success factor, meaning that committees where members received some form of even very small remuneration tend to perform better than committees that worked on a volunteering basis. An example of self-remuneration is where the person who guards the water point during the night receives remuneration for that. Finally, we also found that the vast majority of the DRC WASH Consortium community exempted vulnerable households from payment of water fees. Vulnerable households means with elderly people or people with disabilities or chronic illnesses. And it is important to emphasize that these communities did not perform worse than communities that did not put in place exemptions for vulnerable households. In other words, exempting the poor from water payment did not jeopardize the success under the economic approach, meaning that financial viability of water services and proper policies in this kind of context were not at odds. Something also worthwhile mentioning here is that in some of the areas where the consortium was present, the situation shifted quite suddenly from relative stability to local conflict and population displacement. In those kind of situations, people had to flee their villages, and therefore water point management practices were stopped. However, it's interesting to see that when the situation went more or less back to normal and people were able to go back to their villages, water management practices restarted, including collection of water fees for operation and maintenance of water points. Something that we also did was to check for sustainability of results 2 years after. In practice, what we did was to survey a smaller sample of water points in communities where the consortium's direct activities had ended 2 years before. And the results of the survey were quite interesting. What we found is that nearly all the water points surveyed were still managed by committees 2 years after the exit of the DRC WASH Consortium from those communities. We also found that 81% of the committees stated they had adequate capacities to carry out their duties and responsibilities. And we found that 33% of the committee members were women. This 33% figure was the same as at the time where committees were established. And finally, we found that nearly 90% of the water points surveyed were still in regular use. In general, this kind of results were very encouraging, and we were quite happy to see this kind of results. And these results show that the consortium's economic approach can be successful in fostering sustainable results in WASH in this kind of contexts. Against the backdrop of this general success, some fragile context factors influenced our ways of working. To start, humanitarian aid projects were or had been active in the consortium intervention areas. This means that sometimes communities struggle to engage on the longer-term process of the consortium, as they were used to a culture of short-term assistance. Second, national and local authorities were chronically under-resourced and dependent on external funding. Overall, the WASH sector governance architecture was shaky and left many gray areas. Likewise, the private sector, such as supply chains of hand pump spare parts, suffered from limited access to loans and to other financial products, and suffered from unstable operating conditions. This made them reluctant to invest and to take commercial risks. And last but not least, in most cases, there was a rigid split between humanitarian funding and development funding. This rigidity did not reflect the reality of DRC, where the boundaries between crisis and non-crisis are often blurred. Indirectly, this risks to undermine the effectiveness both of humanitarian aid and of long-term development programs. Despite these challenges, our key conclusion was that development actors, even in fragile contexts, can successfully design and implement WASH interventions that focus on long-term services and not only on short-term achievements. If you want to learn more about the DRC WASH Consortium, you can follow the links below to our publications and videos. You can also contact me at the email address below or contact Concern Worldwide. Thank you.